You probably know someone who seems to carry the emotional weight of the room. They watch the evening news and feel their chest tighten. They listen to a friend's grief and start weeping themselves. The mere thought of disappointing a colleague triggers a wave of physical distress. We usually label these people as highly sensitive. Neurology gives us a different framework. Consider a condition known as mirror touch synesthesia. People with this clinical trait literally feel a physical sensation on their own body when they watch someone else being touched. It proves that absorbing another person's physical or emotional state is a measurable, involuntary neurological reflex. Society praises this extreme sensitivity as profound kindness or selflessness. The reality is far more pragmatic. For the hyper-empath, prioritizing social harmony acts as a biological defense mechanism. They placate and soothe the people around them to stabilize their own nervous systems. Friedrich Nietzsche offered a warning about this exact dynamic. He wrote, "Whoever battles with monsters had better see that it does not turn him into a monster. And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you." The healer risks becoming infected by the exact distress they are trying to cure. For the hyper-empath, avoiding conflict is rarely about taking the moral high ground. It is driven by a desperate, physiological need to avoid the literal pain of emotional contagion. To understand how this infection takes hold, we have to look at the cellular level. Medical researchers have spent decades studying how a feeling successfully leaps from one person's nervous system into another's. The process begins with something called primitive emotional contagion. When two people talk, they continuously and automatically mimic each other's micro-expressions, vocal tones, and postures. This subconscious physical mimicry tricks the brain into replicating the other person's exact emotional state. This diagram shows a cross-section of two brains communicating. When the person on the left experiences pain, their anterior cingulate cortex lights up. But look at the brain on the right. Thanks to mirror neurons, the observer's brain perfectly mirrors that exact same neural activity. They aren't intellectually understanding the pain. Their brain is firing as if the injury happened directly to them. Researchers divide this process into two categories. Affective empathy is the visceral, involuntary mirroring of a feeling. Cognitive empathy is the intellectual ability to take someone else's perspective. Because the brain relies on a single pool of self-regulatory energy, high levels of affective empathy act like a parasite, drawing finite resources away from cognitive processing. When affective empathy totally overrides the cognitive centers, the brain's border control completely fails. It loses the ability to distinguish between a personal trauma and a foreign one. Grounded, reflective, place that vulnerable neurology into an environment of prolonged societal stress and isolation, like a global pandemic, and the system is pushed to the brink. The brain is forced to process a constant, ambient threat with no clear endpoint. This triggers a state known as empathy flooding. The empath's stress response system remains permanently activated, producing an unbearable allostatic load. The nervous system is physically crushed under the weight of chronic distress. This biological failure leads to a highly destructive behavioral pattern, pathological altruism. Driven by a panicked urge to stop their own sympathetic bleeding, the empath intervenes. But because their cognitive processing is offline, their attempts to help cause objective, foreseeable harm. They stay in codependent relationships, they enable addictions, or overparent their children, all in a desperate attempt to soothe their own mirror neurons. The evolutionary tool originally designed to ensure human survival and group connection mutates. It becomes a biological hazard that actively destroys the healer. To survive, the empath has to unlearn a deeply ingrained cultural lesson. Unconditional emotional resonance is a fatal vulnerability. The suffragist Elizabeth Cady Stanton observed the dangers of the fawning response over a century ago. She wrote that the moment we fear the opinions of others and remain silent from motives of policy, the divine floods of light and life no longer flow into our souls. Fearing another person's emotional reaction costs us our own agency. This graph illustrates the psychological cure. It maps human stress levels around a safe horizontal band known as the window of tolerance. Inside this optimal zone, a person can process stress effectively. Outside of it, the nervous system either spikes into hyperarousal and panic or plunges into hypoarousal and complete shutdown. True resilience requires actively expanding this window. By recognizing when empathy flooding begins, an individual can interrupt the cycle, forcing the brain to shift resources away from affective contagion and back toward analytical, cognitive empathy. The Maori novelist Patricia Grace uses a specific metaphor for this careful processing of pain. She calls it unwrapping the bandages. It requires engaging in trauma stewardship, a deliberate practice where you witness the suffering of others without surrendering your own life force to it. Empathy does not require bleeding out alongside someone else. Sustainable resilience demands boundaries. To effectively care for anyone else, you must build the cognitive armor to protect yourself first.